Welcome, everyone, to our final 2025 Resilience by Design learning series. Today, for our November webinar, we're going to be talking about considering the impact of geopolitical risk on your operations. My name is Linda Nelson, and I'll be your speaker today. I do have to let you know that being a speaker today might be a little bit challenging, as I have been down and out with a very bad cold or /flu. And yes, I was going to actually record this for today yesterday, but I didn't have a voice. So I am I've drank lots of water. I have lots of cough drops and cough medicine, and I'm hoping to get this through. If you do hear it go on pause for a minute, it's just because I'm coughing. So please be patient if I have any of those attacks, but I'm excited to see you today. This is our final webinar for the Resilience by Design series. And in case you missed any of the previous ones, our focus this year was on operations. So designing your resilience, looking at the operations side of your business. So we started out in February with determining the context of your resilient strategy, how you should be operating as an agile organization, and then looking at having a systems approach to managing risk. We did jump then to a little bit about IT and looking at some regulations such as DORA. And when we specifically in the summer moved to how to increase the resilience of your crisis management and communications capability, your business continuity management system, your ICT and your data center systems. And then in September, we spoke a lot about supply and value change, which ironically, today's topic is also going to look at geopolitical risk as its impact on supply chains as well. Last month, we looked at the resilience of our security systems, looking at our physical buildings themselves. And today, we're going to look at geopolitical risk on your operations. Just as a reminder, these are available on our website. They're also available on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to earn your certificate, you can go back and watch any of them and just send us an email saying that you've completed them, and we'll mark you down. Those certificates should be going out in December. So today we're going to start by just talking about what is geopolitical risk and whose responsibility is it. Then we're going to look at geopolitical risk in the news. I was actually surprised. I shouldn't have been surprised, but how much news there actually was about it. And then looking at kind of this paradigm shift in moving to power politics again, and how that impacts businesses around the world. And then looking at how we might manage the impact of geopolitical risk specifically on operations. Like I mentioned, the webinar will be available in the next day or two. If you have questions, use the questions button, and I will work on answering those at the conclusion of the webinar or in the email after the webinar. And you do have to attend at least 35 minutes to get a certificate of attendance. Whether you attend in person today or whether you drop off and watch it virtually, just let us know. So I'm giving you our caution. Today we're talking about politics, and understanding that it is impossible to avoid talking about politics when discussing geopolitics. So this is your warning. If this is not a topic you want to have, then you should probably move on to some other event for the day. So ironically, and maybe sadly, I'm not really sure, but when I went to look at all of our different models and frameworks, I found that none of them specifically addressed geopolitical risk. While we do talk about preparedness and managing risk, the geopolitical risk wasn't part of that. And it's I tried to look at why, and I think the why really is because geopolitical risk, at least for those of us living in North America, wasn't something that was a top of mind. It was sort of a board thing or something that, somebody in top management looked at. However, it has now been identified as an emerging risk globally, and it's really time for all of us to start paying attention to this. I am going to acknowledge that this is not a topic I know a lot of, otherwise it would probably already be in at least one of our models. So I have spent a significant amount of time learning as much as I can about it and looking at how we can incorporate geopolitical risk into our models and into our education program in some way or another. But I also want to I want to see how things play out for the next year or two. Because of this being an emerging risk, I think we have a lot to learn, just like we had a lot to learn during and after COVID. I think we have a lot to learn with what's changing for us here politically. So I thought, like everything else, we should start by defining what it is that we're actually talking about. It does refer to the potential for political events to impact us. Things like wars, terrorism, trade disputes, and shifts in global power to disrupt economic activity, the financial markets, and the key part for us here today, the business operations, where geopolitical risk has always been considered in economics and the financial markets. It is now becoming a significant amount of risk that it is impacting many organizations' business operations. So what does it look like? It can look like supply chain disruptions, market volatility, increased uncertainty, which I think we can all feel, which forces businesses to reevaluate their strategies, again, such as in their supply chains and cybersecurity measures. I feel like these are the two pieces that almost everybody that I referenced talked about, but I think we're going to see other impacts as well. And that's why I'm pausing a little bit just to kind of see and to get a bigger picture of what this looks like in the next year or two. So it is a topic I'm personally going to consider, continue to look into. And this idea that they can have a great influence in the private sector or a particular region, but what we're seeing it is having an impact on the global market as a whole, which means we can see escalating conflicts and unrest, and those things can really decimate both international and regional, which can lead to severe losses, including property destruction and even a complete shutdown of business operations. I was very specific looking at the references for what I've shared with you today, and I have quite a long list of references that'll be included because of the need to use references that I felt I could trust, because politics is politics and you can get different messaging depending on what you look at. And so I just wanted to put that out there, that the references I've used, I've tried to use references that would be acceptable no matter what your politics are, no matter where you are in the world. So some examples of types of geopolitical risks. Things like military conflicts and terrorism. When you have wars and terrorist attacks, they can obviously cause loss of life, displacement, and that disruption of trade and travel. Specifically, what we're seeing is that the conflict in the Middle East has affected the Red Sea shipping routes, for example. When you have things like trade disputes and sanctions, tariffs, trade wars and sanctions imposed by one country, and here's my political, we can all say that the United States has done that, can trigger retaliatory responses, which many countries have also done, which is understandable, which has been impacting the global trade flows as well as the financial markets during the past 6 or 8 months. This does, when you also have political instability, where you're seeing internal political polarization, which is very evident, not just in the United States, but many countries around the world, where you're seeing people, I'll use the terms left and right, or liberal or conservative, whatever terms you want to use in your country, we are seeing that polarization happening around the world. Changes in government can also lead to unpredictable changes in economic policies. And what we're seeing is a move towards this idea of protectionism, and an increased government spending depending on what areas you're talking about. The idea of geopolitical risk impacting technological competition is not new, especially with the new technologies like AI, We're seeing really separate technological blocks. And then, of course, we see fragmented regulations. So depending on what countries you're operating in, this can also create new risks. And of course, cybersecurity threats. Since we've spoken quite a bit about cybersecurity threats throughout the webinars this year, I actually not going to talk much more about it than to acknowledge that cybersecurity and cyber attacks are real. And depending on what's happening politically with your country, you may be at more or less risk of being intentionally targeted. So what are some of the impacts? And I'm going to use some business continuity language because I know that many of you are in the business continuity space. But we're seeing that geopolitical risk can have an economic disruption. Again, disruptions in your supply chains. Most of you have to deal with supply chain of some kind. It can affect energy supplies. We'll talk more about that. And of course, increased costs. Economic disruption rarely causes prices to go down. This market volatility, I know that the financial markets and the people in economics have been, looking at geopolitics as far as market volatility, but it is starting now to affect individual businesses as this volatility continues to increase. Also looking at changing your business strategy or adjusting. For example, another example is reconfiguring your supply chains, increasing your focus on cybersecurity, and we'll talk a little bit more about friend shoring. And this really, a lot of this came out of as a result of the pandemic, where we just needed to spend money in order to restructure supply chains. Interestingly enough, right before the pandemic, I did a webinar that really quoted the World Economic Forum almost a lot, saying that these supply chains, these global supply chains, were here to stay because it would cost too much money to change them. Well, because of the impact of COVID on supply chains, and then following that up with the war in Ukraine with the Russians, as well as more recently the Middle East wars, this idea of changing your supply chain strategy to become more local has definitely started, and the money is starting to be spent there. Also, one thing I hadn't really considered is the impact of consumer sentiment. We often talked about reputation as far as doing things poorly or making mistakes, making poor decisions. But this idea that geopolitical stability or instability can impact consumer confidence and spending is, even if the actual economy is performing well, the impact on consumer confidence and being afraid to spend money is also interesting. And of course, we talk about financial stability being impacted, between market volatility and financial stability. I think we're all pretty familiar with that. It's some of the other ones that are starting to reach home and become more personal. So we are seeing a shifting paradigm. So I did look at the most recent global risk report from the World Economic Forum. And one of the comments in there was that for the first time, a major G7 economy has explicitly told its business and policy community that international instability and the fracturing of the old international order, we'll talk a little bit more about that, are risks that all, not just large companies, must now actively plan for. And the 20th edition of the Global Risk Report revealed that the leadership community is concerned more and more by that fractured global landscape, where they're seeing escalating geopolitical, environmental, societal, and technological challenges threatening the stability and progress of the global community. So we're seeing this shifting paradigm, and we're seeing it shift to what's calling that geopolitically charged era. So we can't really be criticized for not making this something top of mind as business continuity and risk people, because it is something that's newer. We could probably go back and say it's been happening for 10 years, specifically in the United States, but then as political leadership changed, we had a calm time, and now it's becoming much more geopolitically charged. and it's impacting more than just the United States, it's impacting the rest of the world. But it is a shift, and it's something we need to be aware of. So as we look, we've always talked about resilience, that we need to be looking forward and ahead, not just responding to what's happening. I really think it's time for those of you in the business continuity and risk space to start looking forward and to start putting, we'll talk about scenario planning and putting together scenarios for how your organization can prepare for this newer era. Because traditional risk management operates on the assumption that we have a stable rules system, largely created, by the United States and the Western world, where businesses can operate with predictable and investable frameworks. And risk management normally focuses on financial and operational issues, which of course most of you are on the operational side of things. But now we've got policy fragmentation, digital threats, we've got financial warfare, and these were things kind of normally seen off to the side, but now they're really starting to pose both competitive and existential risks. Things like regulatory divergence, military actions becoming more frequent, and of course the cybersecurity as well as economic conflicts. So I'm kind of posing this at the front end. I'm so looking at, who should manage geopolitical risk? And so, should management of geopolitical risk be delegated based on its impact? So a lot of us in business continuity focus on not so much the cause, but the impact. So should supply chain people manage geopolitical risk of the supply chain and the finance people manage financial impact? Should it be part of enterprise risk management? And you have a specific geopolitical risk unit to focus on this? And the focus might be dependent on what type of organization you are. Like a tech company might be looking at it to be part of the regulatory affairs function. Where for manufacturers, again, it might be with supply chain because they're trying to ship and receive. But looking at the legal risk side, the reputational risk side, all of it needs to be part of managing risk. Should it be part of the chief operations officer because it's starting more and more to affect operations, or should you identify a chief political officer? This is actually something that has been proposed by both KPMG as well as McKinsey, saying that it's becoming a big enough risk that we need to have somebody in charge of it. And is it a board responsibility? In the past, geopolitics wasn't seen as a board responsibility. It now is. And because it's affecting the growth of your organization, there should be board oversight. So the answer to this is yes. All of these groups should manage geopolitical risk. So if it's not something that you're part of, you need to be looking at your company and saying, how can we start helping to manage geopolitical risk as it impacts me and us in this part of the organization? So if we're looking at the fact that even KPMG is saying that this might be the greatest risk to business growth. And so what they're suggesting is that we look at geopolitical risk drivers, similar to what you see in ESG or environmental, societal, and governance risk drivers, that these geopolitical risk drivers can directly or indirectly affect other types of risks, things that are non-financial, which can ultimately threaten the stability of financial institutions, but really any institution. So what makes them different is that geopolitical risk should be looking at relevant information and facts, trying to predict megatrends, how to define scenarios based on those megatrends, and then setting guidelines and guardrails to effectively really manage risk. So looking at megatrends as a starting point, your risk should be assessed from top down. So analyzing megatrends as well as trends, where trends are seen as kind of more with more of a noticeable trajectory. Megatrends are viewed as more slow moving, that they have a broader reach, they have a longer longevity, and there's a lot of interconnections. And it's going to be influenced on economic, political, and social spheres. What I do like is this picture that KPMG provided, which is you have to look backwards and learn from the past, look at what available information that you have, and then help you to move into the present by looking at what kinds of trends and megatrends are we seeing. And then to look at some of the relevant risk drivers to help you develop what your organization's risk drivers might be and what those scenarios might be tied to those. And I do have to apologize that each one of these references that I'm giving you, we could spend more than an hour talking about each of them. So I'm trying to give you a snapshot into what these look like. And actually, the reason this is even on this webinar year's agenda was because just over a year ago, I had a speaking engagement with the Risk Association where it was in Australia at KPMG, and this was identified as an up-and-coming or emerging risk. And so that's really where this came from. So this is one of the very few, I think it might be the only paper being referenced that hasn't been published in 2025. So this was published in May of 2024, and it was something that KPMG was looking at based on a survey that they do every year. I have very intentionally tried to take what's in the news and what's being written about recently, and by recently I mean in the last 6 to 8 months. So you can see this article was published in November, and most of the news that I've grabbed was published in November or October of this year. So we know that all risks should be on the security leaders' radar, but we're seeing geopolitics is coming closer to the center stage, really in the past 10 years. And companies that have been international have always had geopolitics on mind because they need to be aware of it. But now what we're seeing, and this is kind of a US-focused article from ASIS, is that US-based companies are way more aware of it than they've been in the past. And so those of you outside of the US may have had this more top of mind than some of us here in the US. It's sort of ironic that we're causing a lot of the disruption, not all of it, but a lot of it. And we're the least aware of how it's been operating in the past. But there's all sorts of things that companies are going to need to be aware of, even if you don't operate internationally. Reuters published this, that says on Friday, but it was 2 weeks ago almost, that geopolitical risk topped the list of financial stability concerns in a Federal Reserve in the US article published, or survey published 2 weeks ago. I'm going to move to Australia because I wanted to make sure that we weren't just focusing on what's happening in the US. And the Australian government has published some really good papers in their Australia Defense and Security News, and talking about the rise of geopolitical risk. And they're really looking at this from the opposite point of view geographically than maybe I would see. And that the rise of China and assertive Russia, populism in Western democracies, and the retreat of global institutions have all contributed to the dramatic uptick of political and business uncertainty. So again, they're tying the political uncertainty to business uncertainty. And this was published just last week. And they published the Australian Critical Infrastructure Security Center published its 3rd annual risk review. So that's what I'm going to be quoting from here in the next couple of slides. And specifically looking at geopolitical risk from the viewpoint of the Australian government, and it's specifically from critical infrastructure, but I do think it's relevant to everyone. That it's an ongoing reality for all critical infrastructure sectors. And they also stated that in last year's report, geopolitical resilience was a major area of activity for the organization itself. And I'm not sure what they mean by geopolitical resilience, and I'm not going to dive into that today. I just want to stick with talking about geopolitical risk. So they are noting that this is becoming a rising concern for the private sector. When you know, obviously they're again quoting the armed conflict in Eastern Europe, the tensions in the South China Sea, to cyber attacks, to disinformation campaigns. Again, like I said, I was very careful about who I used as references, that the whole world is confronting a new area of uncertainty, an era of uncertainty, and this is going to be reconfiguring the international business landscape. They again quote the physical supply chains being more vulnerable than ever, and that we're seeing geopolitically driven supply chain disruption intentionally. And so what they're saying is, I'm just going to have you substitute critical infrastructure operators with business, wherever you are, that you need to clearly identify and monitor your supply chains that are essential to your business so that you can manage associated risks and mitigate them wherever possible. And here's where they really draw the line to having business continuity and resilience mechanisms when global conditions leave no choice but to endure the resulting supply shocks. They provide a case study from the middle of this year, citing escalating tensions in the Middle East, demonstrated how geopolitical shocks can reverberate through your critical supply chains. And over 12 days, Israel, Iran, and the United States were engaged in direct military strikes that happened very quickly. Surprising most of us in the US as well that we bombed Iran. But because of that, the Iran's government actively considered closing the Strait of Hormuz. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. But that's a choke point through which over 20% of the global oil consumption flows. Closure would have disrupted not just the global energy markets, but around 70%, can you imagine that, of Australia's imports, with the flow-on effects for freight, agriculture, and fuel security. Actually talking about fuel security, if you could have an impact of 70% of your energy. Although it was quickly resolved, the event demonstrated the fragility of the global supply routes and the speed within which international instability can disrupt those essential sectors. Also talking about this is deepening existing fractures and creating new ones, both domestically and internationally. And it's changing the way that at least the Australian government is approaching risk. And by the way, Australia is a big leader in this area, and it is if you want to look at a lot of what they're doing, they are on the, I'll say you kind of a cutting word there, but cutting edge on these topics. And so looking at the fact that there's an eroding trust in democratic institutions is compounding the rapid amount of change and the demographic divides that we're seeing. And these geostrategic shifts are really becoming a hurdle. So Australia recognizes that they're inextricably linked economically to the rest of the world, well, we all are. And that these connections form a critical foundation for their economy. And so while we have this new, ambiguous, and complex environment, and they're saying it's not new, I'm saying that it's becoming bigger, which is creating more uncertainty, which is impacting market response mechanism, and is really impeding everyone's ability for short-term planning because you don't know what it's going to be like in 6 months. And so how do you plan for that? They also gave another case study really showing about there was in late 2024, November and December, about a year ago, a campaign of physical sabotage. We saw this in other places around the world too, but of course this is coming from Australia, where there was state-linked Russian threat actors concealing incendiary devices in international air cargo to target countries providing support to Ukraine. Disruption from the attack was initially limited to fires at freight facilities in both Germany and the United Kingdom. However, due to the international nature of global air freight, it was quickly identified that other countries, including Australia, could be affected, both deliberately and inadvertently. So to protect the freight systems and ensure the safety of the public, Australia's Department of Home Affairs issued a special security directive, and this was meant to reduce exposure to the sabotage threat and to detect potential attempts to target the Australian transport sector. And this is another example of how state actors like Russia may deliberately use physical sabotage as a political tool during times of heightened tension. And just understanding that Australia, like any other country, is not immune from those potential consequences. and that we all need to recognize when we're talking about risk drivers and scenarios is that sabotage to critical infrastructure has become a key tool for geopolitical disruption. They gave several examples of how they've been disrupted in the past. And it was, again, I can't go into it any deeper in this short amount of time frame, but it's a really interesting, if lengthy, read. So Australia understands that their reliance on infrastructure networks extend beyond Australian territory, and it really increases their vulnerability to sabotage. They noted that submarine cables carry 99% of Australia's international internet traffic through international waters, and that many sectors, of course, rely on those services provided also by space-based assets. It was also something I hadn't really considered, was not just underwater, but space, and that both maritime and aviation supply lines facilitate their connection to that global economy. So I also found it was really interesting that the internal auditors, the Institute for Internal Auditors, was looking at risk, not that they shouldn't be looking at risk, but that they found that geopolitical macroeconomic uncertainty came up as number 6 when they did their annual survey of top 5 risks that their organization faces. Notice there's a different amount by country. And so with North America, Latin America, and Europe being pointing at that as higher than some of the others. Also notice that while it's still sitting in 6th place, that it has gained 10 percentage points between 2024 and 2025. So it is becoming, I think in their next survey, you might see this raise into the top 5. And then interestingly enough, when they looked at risk level differences by industry, and they asked companies to identify unique risks that were high to them, geopolitical uncertainty came up high for manufacturing, mining, energy and water, agriculture, forestry and fishing, wholesale and resale, as well as transport and storage. And given what we've learned so far, this is not surprising. This is kind of an output of what we're talking about with that energy as well as supply chain issues. Looking specifically at the financial sector, they're also seeing in banks the complexity and uncertainties growing. There's a lot of tensions around raising credit risk, and that digital sales and servicing are also challenging operational resilience. So again, this is starting to drive down into operations now. And so just volatile interest rates and credit risk are affecting the balance sheets for everyone in really unpredictable ways. And new regulations are continuing to emerge that makes that even more complex. I was really surprised that New York Life Investments had, I don't know why I was surprised, but the fact that they were looking at geopolitical risk in the shifting world order from the viewpoint of investors. Again, financial side of it, but we all are driven by financial aspects. And so this was published in May of 2025. And I wonder what it would look like now, just 5 or 6 months later. They're also addressing that shifting world order. And so recognizing that really since the end of the Cold War, that the US has led that world order and really helping to provide that relatively stableness where we've had rules-based international cooperation and a broad commitment to trade liberalization. But what's really part of the result of this is that benefits of the globalization have been unevenly distributed, where while the markets have expanded, consumer prices have fallen in some areas, but a lot of the communities have been left behind. So I'll just, the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer. And this has been a lot of the fuel for political disillusionment. And again, it's not just in the US, it's happening in many countries around the world. And so this has led to this populist movement where voters in the countries where you have the ability to vote in your leaders this desire to change of the status quo, and it really hasn't stayed contained. It's really helped to accelerate that broader geopolitical shift, and nations are starting to turn inward and prioritizing national strength over global integration. And this is what's really fueling that new era of strategic rivalry that we're seeing, that shift of the world order. So looking at kind of going back 100 years ago, or maybe not quite that long, but where we had the power politics, we had moved away from that, but now it's really helping to reshape the relationships between geopolitics and economies. Where US security guarantees once helped shield markets from worst case geopolitical shocks, the policy of the US has grown less predictable. And so, I don't know, you may have heard this, that there's, tariffs being used and sanctions being used in different ways. And this has helped to shift defense commitments and make those core tools of that statecraft. Now, a lot of this started as a result of the pandemic, where you see that measurable increase in geopolitical risk and seeing those structural shifts. While competition over resources has long shaped geopolitical dynamics, changes in that global economic structure, so we're back to the economics, has increased competition over technology, where there's only some places where there's only some countries where we can get what we need to build our technology systems, where there's only some places where we can get the energy that we need, as well as those financial supply chains. And this has all helped, I'll use the word fuel in quotation marks, that quantifiable increase in geopolitical events. Trade friction, and this, back when this was written back in May, was really focused on the US and China, really helped to increase the growing awareness of supply chain vulnerabilities and the rise of economic nationalism. I never thought I would say those words together, but it has really also helped to contribute to that fragmented landscape. And so what we need to start seeing, and this is why I'm saying this needs to get on everyone's landscape and really needs to be a part of everyone's planning for the future. And I originally had that slide at the end of who should be managing this, but I wanted to propose it at the beginning to help this idea that it's not episodic and it's going to continue, and it's most likely going to get worse. And so we need to start planning for it now at all levels of the organization and give it more consistent consideration as we look at how we look at our overall ways of managing risk. And so when we see these global tensions rising, we're seeing the continued breakdown of old norms, that this could drive some lasting shifts in economies and markets. As our world is getting smaller and smaller and the cooperation is becoming more tense, it's going to impact all of us and drive these lasting shifts. One of the things that they showed as an illustration, which is really interesting, is this paradigm shift from event risk to market realities, that COVID was initially seen as an event risk. Excuse me, where it has more of a beginning and an end. But because it drove that major supply chain rewiring and this idea of resilience over efficiency, so moving from just in time to strengthening our supply chains and having more than one, just even understanding what our supply chains look like. But looking at resilience over efficiency is having a lasting impact on global economies. And I don't think this is a bad thing, by the way. I think we had gone way, I don't know, left or right, whatever you want to call it, to this just-in-time idea. And I think it's time that we become more centered and focus on resilience as a way to moderate some of this, just getting it for the cheapest, getting it for the fastest, even though there's a lot of risk involved, and that risk had been ignored for many, many years. Kind of looking back again at the great power politics, this is what's really driving that geopolitical risk. And so kind of being driven by national security, industrial resilience, and economic self-reliance. Again, moving inward and looking inward versus looking outwards. Policies that are once seen as protectionist, such as onshoring, friendshoring, and industrial policy, are now mainstream, as most countries are looking to secure their supply chains and support strategic industries. And I don't think this is a bad thing. I think we need to start coming in the middle with some of these things, but I'm not an economist, I guess is the best way to say that. But for example, in the US, the CHIP Act was a huge investment by the government to pivot from a market-driven efficiency market to a state-backed industrial strategy, looking at how can we bring some of these things back to the US, even if we're still relying on parts from other countries. How can we now build them in the US? Japan and the European Union are also implementing similar policies to incentivize, like, for example, the domestic semiconductor production. I'm sure there's many more examples that we could share here as well. So all of this comes with the potential for structurally higher inflation as we see global trade declining. So it's a combination of all of these things that are impacting global trade, which helps everyone, but there are risks involved with that. So this is a chart that I thought was really helpful. They kind of identified what they have as the principles of great power politics. So economic nationalism, where countries are increasingly pursuing onshoring, reshoring, and strengthening their own domestic industries. And then moving to the weaponization of trade and finance, where we've seen sanctions and tariffs and financial restrictions being deployed more frequently as ways to implement geopolitical pressure. And this, of course, even the New York Life is saying that this is especially being done by the United States. Preference for bilateral relations over multilateral institutions, where we do see United States President Trump moving to, just talk with the US with specific countries, looking at those bilateral negotiations and really ignoring the Trans-Pacific partnerships and the World Trade Organization that used to be the priorities. Looking at strategic competition with an emphasis on that industrial policy. So where governments direct investment into strategic sectors to bolster industrial capacity and national competitiveness. And again, none of these things are bad in and amongst themselves. It's just when they start to create more of a risk than what they're trying to fix. But again, like I believe in resilience over efficiency, that we do need to reconfigure our supply chains to emphasize resilience and redundancy, moving away from that over cost optimized globalization. So like I said, it's more or less how all of these position themselves within the power politics that increases geopolitical risk versus any one of them individually. I also thought it was interesting when they looked at the geopolitical risk by region, and we started with, on the left, outer space. I haven't even think I've said that word, outer space. I don't even know what inner space is, but this idea that we're also having geopolitical rivalries over satellite dominance and space resource extraction. If you pay a little bit of attention to this in the news, I thought that there was, I think that Russia attacked a satellite of some other country very recently, and I don't remember which, but again, I can't dig into these things on these short webinars. But we are going to be seeing satellites and other things that are in, quote, outer space as having an impact on our geopolitics. In Canada, they cited rising resource nationalism and US competition, which is straining their energy exports and trade relations. In Mexico, again, they cited strained US relations and a growing cartel influencing, undermining political stability. In the United States, they pointed to escalating trade tensions, straining economic growth. In South America, remigration pressure straining fiscal stability. I think if this was written today, they might be pointing to Venezuela as an issue with the United States, but this was looking at all of South America. And then I'll say the other side of the world, or maybe your side of the world, the Arctic itself, where you see intensified competition between Russia, China, and NATO over Arctic resources. We don't see any sort of resolution in sight for the Russian and Ukraine war. Excuse me. In the Middle East, where we're continuing to see the rivalries and proxy conflicts fueling regional instability. Again, I don't think any of us has an answer for that. We're seeing in East Africa terrible humanitarian crises and regional instability. You don't get stability when you've got a humanitarian crisis going on. And again, I'm not going to address the cause of that, or where it's been amplified. But North Korea, there's heightened regional tensions from increased nuclear and missile testing in China and Taiwan. You've got that cross-strait crisis due to intensified Chinese military and economic pressure. And Australia, they're particularly citing a mounting competition with China over regional influence and trade dependencies. So kind of moving on to specific areas where geopolitical risk focuses, and this is about supply chain again, where we all are dealing with supply chain issues. And so it isn't just geopolitical risk, but this is a newer thing that's impacting the supply chain. We've talked about the tariffs, which has impacted trade policy, and they look back historically that shipping patterns show that previous tariffs have influenced shipping behaviors. I think we could all give examples of that. And so we need to build our supply chain resilience, looking at building stronger supplier relationships, investing in technology, as well as sustainable practices. This might be where you start, where every one of you has some sort of, a role in managing risk in your organization and looking at strengthening your supply chains. Also, the geopolitical impact on risk on the energy security itself, where everyone needs to have available and accessible energy resources because it's crucial to everyone's economic development. And looking at the impact of climate change, cybersecurity threats, and the war in Ukraine have really increased the concern for energy security worldwide. And this remains a top 2025 geopolitical risk, and I'm assuming that it will continue in 2026. Also looking specifically at climate risk and geopolitics. It's a very polarizing topic and one of the biggest geopolitical risks of 2025 that, it's not going to go away. Climate change, I'm sorry, I'll just say it is real. And it's very apparent in the form of, all of us deal with extreme weather events, species extinction, rising sea levels, and growing poverty. And so we can't, while each country is responsible for climate in their own country, it's sort of like, I was laughing because in my home, my front yard, they took down a tree that had been hit by lightning and had died. And so I'm like, oh, maybe I won't have as many leaves in my front yard. But ironically, the trees down the road don't know that those leaves should stay where, on their property. And so I find myself raking leaves that aren't from any trees in my own yard. Well, just like leaves not knowing the boundary between properties, we are in one world, and this one world is being impacted by climate change, and we all need to have a role in it. But understanding that there are countries that heavily rely on fossil fuels, and they are resisting that shift, even in the United States, where we have spent a lot of money to build up more climate-friendly ways to gain energy. Our government right now is resisting that, and you see that in other countries as well. Kind of finishing up with cyber attacks and cyber warfare. This is becoming a bigger risk with this idea that it's becoming a warfare. It has been for a long time, But now government networks and private sector networks and infrastructure are all susceptible to hacking and espionage, and they're becoming much more targeted. Also, just looking at how we behave because of geopolitical risks. So this could be because of a nation's or a country's involvement in international affairs. Usually this comes about when there's a major shift in power or conflict or crisis, which we've noted several of those here today. And so while it can be impacting just that country itself, more likely it impacts the global community at large, kind of summarizing what we've been talking about. And it is really difficult to predict. So here, as we're trying to look forward and look at scenarios, I think we really need to be paying attention to scenario planning so that we have a lot of options ahead of us, because it does depend on how people or how countries or how leaders respond to that risk. And it's bigger than what we do with ourselves. It's because it's the leaders of countries that are impacting each of us. Also, legal and regulatory risks as they relate to energy, the environment, and security. All of this, can evolve into the changes of the laws of a country. And so the laws dictate the functioning of business, particularly international businesses that have a holding within whatever region they're in. And so this type of geopolitical risk can also have an impact on individual businesses, entire industries, and again, the global economy as a whole. So kind of going back to the World Economic Forum, they were really talking about how do you address this? So you need to put together some sort of a framework. So you should, as part of your audit process or part of your risk assessment process, be auditing and assessing your current geopolitical exposure. So focusing on this as part of the internal audit, where you meticulously map all of your operations and your supply chains and your revenue streams across these different geopolitical risk zones. And this might be totally different than what you're used to doing in your risk assessment and your business impact analysis. So again, broadening the scope is going to make you more relevant to leadership as well when you're talking the language that they need to talk about. And so you also need to look at all of your regulatory dependencies and your compliance requirements across all those different jurisdictions. And then go back and look at your current stakeholder relationships, identify any potential conflicts of interest, and really pinpoint those areas of vulnerability. One of the things that I've always agreed with, but never really understood the vital importance of, is in any management system standard in clause 4, you have to identify your interested parties and all your relationships with those. And so I think this is really, really an important aspect of this process when you're looking at geopolitical exposure, is looking at those stakeholder relationships. Also looking at your intelligence capabilities. You have to be able to look ahead. You have to be able to see what's going on. So having those cross-functional teams, remember at the beginning who's in charge of this? It has to be all of us. So we have to be able to communicate and be able to link that geopolitical analysis to those specific business functions like R&D and sales. Develop those sophisticated scenario planning frameworks and stress testing or exercising, using your exercises to stress test protocols to prepare for those various geopolitical futures, those scenarios that you've developed. And making sure that you integrate geopolitical risk assessment into existing business continuity planning. And again, this came from the World Economic Forum, which I really liked their call out to business continuity specifically. And then going back to that board level, elevate geopolitical risk to a strategic level, and making sure that everyone in the organization's highest levels is very aware of this. So maybe you have to expand your existing government affairs roles, or like we said, dedicate a more senior position. Just looking at that seamless collaboration with other C-suite members is really, really important, so that you can have that holistic approach to both risk management and business continuity. There's a lot of references here. They're all equally important. They're all pretty long. And they, if you want to dig into these, I would strongly recommend taking a look at these as in your organization, that you start to look at and maybe you already have. And I didn't do any surveys today because I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to actually do this in person or not. But I would be really, really curious is if in the post survey, if you could share, you know, to what extent that your organization and you particularly on the team that you're on has looked at geopolitical risk as part of your risk planning. I'm gonna just to get us off on time today, and because I really don't feel well, I'm gonna first all those questions. Please use that survey to post some of your questions, as well as anything that you'd like to share that I might be able to follow up with you on this. Because like I said, it is an area that I'd like to look at moving on in the future as to how it should be incorporated into all the different ways that we manage risk. As a reminder, you know, I-Corps does teach and certify leaders in resilience, whether at the manager, professional, or executive level. And as a summary, this is the conclusion of our series for this year. We will be beginning again in February of 2026. And if you have any theme ideas, some of you have given ideas on particular topics, but we are considering several different themes for next year. Like this was a focus on operations and operational resilience. And we have been more focusing on strategic things in the past, but really encourage you to share what you'd like to learn more about. And if you could think about a larger theme that we might incorporate some of the other ideas in, would be fantastic. Again, if you want to contact us, you can use that education@theicorps.org email. And make sure that, you know, if you have watched some of the older webinars that you don't have credit for and you'd like to earn your certificate, please do so. Thank you very much for attending today, and have a great rest of your week.